Welcome to the Daily Dispatch. First up, we'll be covering the Russia-Ukraine war, where 60 troops have been killed in one of the biggest strikes during the conflict. Then we'll be taking you to some planetary calls for action, with the World Bank looking to secure funds to combat the climate change. And to round up the dispatch, we'll be spotlighting the meeting of the National Security Committee of Pakistan as it looks to tackle terrorism and economic challenges for the country. We're here to give you the news and to help you infer the world around you. I'm Tayyaba Nisar Khan, and here is your Daily Dispatch. In an update from the Ukraine-Russia war, Russia made a rare acknowledgement that 63 Russian troops were killed in one of the deadliest airstrikes after 4 US-made rocket launchers hit the barracks in the Makhivka, a twin city of Donetsk, causing huge flares as well. Now earlier, Ukraine stated around 400 troops were killed. However, Russia, in an official statement, has refuted this figure. The recent attack by Ukraine caused outrage among the Russian military analysts, who questioned the military leaders, claiming that such an event was bound to happen since the troops were being housed near an ammunition storage facility. Now, the attack was followed by Ukraine downing 59 Russian drones over Kyiv, which Ukraine claimed were Iran-made Shahid drones. Earlier, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, had stated that Russia, in a bid to demilitarize them, is planning on carrying out the attacks by using the Shahid drones. The drones allegedly target the civilian infrastructure that causes energy outages as well. Now, this attack is significant because of the extent of the losses that elicited a rare admission of killings by the Russian authorities, and it would also suggest a shift in Ukraine's strategy. Ukraine had been using long-range US-made rockets to target Russian supply lines and military logistics. However, more recently, they have been targeting the military bases and the Russian troops' concentrations. Now, in our previous dispatches, we told you about the talks of peace by both the Russia and the Ukraine side. President Putin called for negotiations with all the parties involved, while Ukraine's president suggested a peace summit in February 2023. However, with a constant barrage of attacks from both sides, any prospect of peace talks stands diminished. On to the World Bank now, which is working on a roadmap document to expand its lending portfolio to address issues like climate change. Now, the document has already been shared with the shareholder governments and will be presented for approval before the joint IMF and World Bank Committee in October 2023. To realize the goals of its new plan, the World Bank is seeking more funds from the governments, as well as private sector. Now, climate financing has emerged as one of the alternative sources of funding to support the mitigation and adaptation efforts that address the climate change issues. The World Bank's new roadmap is likely to lend a boost to the sector. Now, combating climate change is expensive. According to a report presented at COP27, the developing countries alone require $1 trillion to meet their goals set out in their nationally determined contributions. Now, human-induced climate change has become the greatest threat to human civilization and the natural environment the world has ever seen. Erratic weather patterns like droughts, abnormal precipitations, receding glaciers, rising sea levels, and polluted air threaten to wreak havoc on the planet. And the poorest countries are paying the heaviest price, despite their comparatively little greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, the entire African continent is responsible for just 3% of the emissions. To deal with the climate change, industrialized states have been urged to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels and help vulnerable and developing states to shift away from them and transition to renewable energy resources. For our next dispatch, we're covering updates from a 2-day meeting of the National Security Committee of Pakistan, the country's apex security forum. Now, the meeting of the NSC was held in the wake of the terrorist outfit TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, escalating its operations in Pakistan over the past few months, and also focused on an economic roadmap towards recovery of the country. Now, in a strong worded statement, the NSC categorically demanded that the Afghan Taliban government takes action against the TTP elements present in Afghanistan, a base of operations that is being used by the militant outfit to conduct the operations in Pakistan. The National Security Committee statement iterated Pakistan's security is uncompromisable and the full writ of the state will be maintained on every inch of Pakistan's territory. Now, recent statements by Pakistani officials calling out the Afghan Taliban government for not keeping up with their commitments of putting a stop to Afghan soil being used for terrorism against Pakistan have been met with criticism from the Afghan officials, with the Afghan officials denying the presence of TTP camps within Afghanistan. Experts suggest such developments are not conducive to maintaining a cordial relationship between the two governments, a necessity for ensuring peace and stability, as well as counter-terrorism efforts in the region, with the two countries sharing a border. However, with the recent rise in terrorist activities, the NSC meeting and a statement of intent come as a much-needed impetus to ensure the disjointed efforts of the DTP do not develop into a bigger threat. Similarly, focusing on internal security, the NSC also took the decision on the provincial apex committees, restoring them to bolster the capacity of provincial law enforcement agencies and the counter-terrorism departments as well. The NSC also agreed on several economic measures to counter the current fiscal crisis, including decisions on import rationalization, preventing illegal currency outflows, improving agricultural output, and supporting the manufacturing sector to ensure food security, import substitution, and employment. Now we'll talk about some thawing relationships. Israel Foreign Minister Eli Cohen said he plans to attend the summit in March with his counterparts from the Arab countries in Morocco. Although he did not much name the countries, it is assumed that the countries are UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, which normalized the relationships with Israel under the Abraham Accords signed in 2022. Last year in March, Israel hosted the foreign ministers of these countries and Egypt, along with the U.S. Secretary of State in the Negev Summit. Now, Israeli foreign minister claimed establishing of ties with these has yielded greater economic and security dividends, with economic trade reaching around $3 billion in 2022. Although the US and Israel have asserted the Abraham Accords is a roadmap for peace in the Middle East, experts of the region say as long as the Palestine issue, which enjoys popular support, is not resolved, selling peace to the Arab world would be difficult. Moreover, the Abraham Accords so far have not been able to draw in regional heavyweights, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, despite Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's hope that establishing the normal ties with Riyadh was a question of when, not if. Our next news story takes you to Iran, where skepticism about whether the country's controversial morality police was disbanded or not continues. And in the most recent development, the country has resumed warnings of mandatory headscarves for women, including for those traveling in cars. Earlier, the Prosecutor General of Iran, Mohammad Jafar Montazeri, put out a statement that the morality police has shut down after nationwide protests erupted in the country following the death of a 22-year-old, Mahsa Amini. Amini died shortly after being released from custody following her arrest for an alleged breach of the dress code, with her family accusing the morality police of subjecting her to torture. The Iranian authorities denied the allegations and have since cracked down on the protests that have continued for months. The government has also been accusing the West, especially the United States, of fanning these protests in the country for its own political agenda. But many countries in the West, as well as international organizations, have continued to criticize Iran for its response to the protests. Earlier in December, Iran was voted out of the Commission of the Status of Women via a resolution which was brought in by the United States. And with this new move to resume the warnings amid the protest, it seems that the government of Iran is looking towards continuing of its hard-line approach under the conservative leadership of Ibrahim Raisi. Lastly, we're covering the tech industry, as South Korea reveals plans for a bigger tax break to boost chip production in the country. The country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has pushed forward a plan to incentivize the sector, and a revised bill from the Finance Ministry aims to provide a tax credit of 15% on investments, up from 8% in the bill passed last month. Similarly, smaller companies will receive a tax break of 25% on their capital spending, up from the previous 16%. As per the reports, additional investment will also provide another break of 10%, and the revised tax scheme can reduce the tax burden on companies by $2.8 billion. Now, the recent supply chain disruptions during the pandemic have pushed the US, China, and Japan to pour resources towards self-reliance and insulate the domestic industries from external shocks. Similarly, this move to bolster the chip manufacturing in South Korea comes as we see many countries struggling to keep up with their demand for the semiconductors. particularly because of the developing US-China competition in the field of technology. South Korea hopes to secure a bigger market share with this move, as companies like Samsung and SK Hynix would face hurdles to their manufacturing and export operations in other countries. However, an implementation of these revised tax incentives will require approval from the majority-wielding opposition party at the National Assembly, dominated by the Democratic Party of Korea, currently looking unlikely. Now, critics argue that these incentives will come at the cost of government revenues and only benefit a few big manufacturers. That's all, folks. We'd be happy to receive your feedback and suggestions. We'll be back tomorrow with more bite-sized news that keeps you up to date with what's going on in the country, the region, and the globe. I'm Tayyaba Nasar Khan, and this was your Daily Dispatch.